Good evening. Welcome to the World War II Discussion Forum's fall series of lectures. I'm excited to be joined tonight by our speakers. Before I introduce them, I want to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speakers have graciously agreed to take questions after their prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speakers and the audience when asking your question. We'll take 30 minutes of questions and go, or I'm sorry, we'll take probably 15 or so minutes of questions and go to about 9 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a YouTube channel. Please see the icon at the top of the website. As I noted, this talk will be recorded and posted shortly afterwards. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this evening's speakers, and that's no mistake. These are co-authors who've written a wonderful book, Margaret and David White. Margaret Stanback White received her BA from Harvard. Following a career as a research scientist, she began to freelance as a researcher and editor on nonfiction book projects about scientific breakthroughs and how they've changed the course of history. David Fairbank White studied history at Harvard and worked as a reporter for the New York Times. He has written for national magazines, including Fortune, New York, Parade, and Reader's Digest. This is their first book working together, and I'll read a review or two, and you'll see it's been quite a success. And I believe they've got another project in the works. And to the book at hand, Wings of War, the World War II fighter plane that saved the Allies and the believers who made it fly, tells the remarkable story behind the rise of the P-51 Mustang, the World War II fighter plane that destroyed the Luftwaffe and made D-Day possible. The reviews have been stellar. I'm just going to read two. The World War II History magazine notes that most histories of the P-51 are combat histories, focusing on the plane and its pilots in action. These authors deliver, but they also delve deeply into the fighter's rocky origins and the struggle to bring the plane to production. The story of Edgar Chmud, the man who designed the P-51 and the later F-86, is fascinating and enriches the understanding of his creation. The tales of many others who brought this dream to fruition are also reviewed in detail. While the World War II magazine notes the book is great for aviation, war, and history buffs, as well as those who enjoy learning about all subjects, Wings of War is a passion book that was highly researched by its co-authors. These authors have done wonderful jobs using their skills to bring this slice of history to life. And with that, I will turn it over to Margaret and David, and I thank them for joining us.
Thank you, Greg. I'd like to first just say that we're honored and delighted to be meeting with the World War II Discussion Forum. We get so excited and feel very privileged to spread the story of the P-51 Mustang because the one little airplane came in and really demolished the Luftwaffe in the middle of the war and turned around the whole air war. And turning around the air war was the key to the land war. So this plane really was the hinge on which all of World War II swung. It is poorly understood that World War II in Europe, at its most difficult passages, was a close run, tense thing in danger of collapsing. There were 2 points at which the whole array of Allied forces almost failed, and the war was almost lost to the Nazis. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, Hitler's U-boats were winning at sea. The British Admiralty had calculated that if Admiral Karl Dönnitz's subs sank 600,000 tons of Allied shipping a month, transatlantic convoys bringing supplies from North America, everything from helmets to tanks to coffee and cigarettes, would be cut. That winter, the German U-boats were very nearly reaching that mark. The second near disaster of the war came in the autumn of 1943. That chilly October, American bombers looked as though they would succumb to the superior fighter planes of the Luftwaffe. Navies were useless for striking at Fortress Germany on land. The land war would not begin until D-Day. The only weapon that could hit Germany and attack the Nazi citadel was the airplane. And in that bleak, cold autumn of 1943, U.S. 8th Air Force bomber squadrons were running casualty rates as high at 75% time to do it. The air war, on which the entire Allied prosecution of the war was centered, was harrowingly close to falling through. And then what? How could we strike at Germany? How could a D-Day landing be staged with the Supreme Luftwaffe holding air superiority in the skies overhead? At this desolate juncture, the North American P-51 Mustang charged onto the scene, a fast, peerless, high-performance fighter aircraft which could, for the first time, outfly anything in the German arsenal. And we're ready for the next slide. And then at the 11th hour, the Mustang achieved a stunning feat of arms, destroying the Luftwaffe in less than 6 months and opening the way for the Normandy invasion. In 1943 and 1944, the P-51B Mustang became the hinge of all the war, the weapon that effectively decided World War II. But that gets ahead of our story. The airplane was the linchpin of the great Allied victory in Europe. The airplane that was the linchpin of the great Allied victory in Europe was born in the mind of a boy. Edgar Schmood, its designer, and this is Edgar Schmood on the screen. Edgar Schmood, its designer, was a poor student in Landsberg, Germany, who preferred daydreaming about machines to the drudgery of school. When his father could not afford university for Edgar, the young man taught himself mechanics and engineering, then apprenticed himself to a local engine factory, all the while dreaming of designing airplanes. For a time, he designed auto parts, but Weimar Germany after the First World War was no place for a young man with dreams. He emigrated to Brazil to join his two brothers. There, still dreaming of airplanes, he first worked as an auto mechanic and soon made his way to the States to work for Fokker Aviation. By 1935, he had landed in Los Angeles at North American Aviation. He was, in his own words, a Flugzeugkonstrukteur, an airplane designer for a company making planes for the American military. Now he sat at his drawing board, ready to meet his destiny. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
There it is.
And that's Schmoed sitting in the cockpit of a P-51. As the Battle of Britain raged in the summer of 1940, the British were ordering arms from America. North American was approached to design and build a new fighter for the RAF. Edgar Schmood got to work at once. He designed the plane in an astonishing 102 days. The P-51 Mustang, which sprang from his drawing board, would not only be a champion of the air war in World War II, it would also represent a landmark in aviation history, a revolutionary aircraft that set many aviation milestones. Next slide, please. And that's the first prototype, a copy of any P-51 Mustang. It was designated the NA-73X, and this was the first one extant in Los Angeles, California. The Mustang was the best propeller-powered military aircraft in history. It was the last significant piston engine plane in the U.S. Air Force before the jet age swept in. It was also a breakthrough pursuit plane with many innovative features. The design of its wings was entirely new. These so-called laminar flow wings vastly improved lift. It also incorporated so-called second-degree curves to streamline its fuselage. It used the concept of dynamic balance to perfect the aeronautical stability of tail and body. Many of the small details were new. The plane's duralumin skin was extremely thin, with the screws flush with that skin. These innovations made it faster and more maneuverable than any fighter in the U.S. Army Air Forces. The first Mustangs began to arrive in England in October 1941, designated P-51As, and were tested by the RAF. The new plane handled well, but it had a flaw. which had nothing to do with Schmooz's design. The American Allison engine was underpowered and performed badly at high altitude. At first, this was not a problem for the British. The Battle of Britain by then was over, and they could use the Mustang for low altitude reconnaissance. But suddenly a new German fighter showed up in the skies. It was the Focke-Wulf 190, and it was faster and more deadly than anything the British could put up. Right away, they began thinking about a new fighter. Next slide, please. And that is a Focke-Wulf FW-190, which could beat anything that the British had at that time, even the Spitfire. It was more powerful than the Spitfire, had a longer range than the Spitfire, and it was more heavily armed. Chance now intervened and made history. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, Ronnie Harker, was asked by a colleague at the RAF's Air Fighter Development Unit in Duxford, Cambridgeshire, to test fly the new American plane. Next slide, please. And that's Ronnie Harker, the Rolls-Royce test pilot, who first flew the prototype version of the Mustang. While airborne, Harker had an epiphany. As he flew over the English fields, diving and veering through the sky, he noticed that the Mustang not only handled elegantly, it was also faster than the Spitfire, Britain's star fighter, at the same horsepower. Harker thought in a flash of insight that if the superb aerodynamics of the Mustang were combined with a more powerful engine, specifically the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, developing 1,490 horsepower, the resulting machine could be a phenomenon. Harker was sure he had stumbled on the weapon that could slay the Nazi juggernaut. Harker lobbied to replace the American Allison engine with British Rolls-Royce engine on 5 new Mustangs. Next slide, please. This is the Merlin engine. To give you an idea of how powerful it was, an 18-wheel semi-truck rig has a diesel which puts out about 500 horsepower. This engine put out 1,500 horsepower. It was tremendously powerful. Using the new engine would be an industrial heart transplant, much like implanting a Jarvik 7 artificial heart. The two engines were almost the same size. The Merlin was 290 pounds heavier. Changes had to be made at the front of the Mustang. The engine was raised 3.5 inches. At last, on October 13th, 1942, airplane number AL975-G was taken off by Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, Captain R.T. Shepard. He flew 8 test flights. The Mustang ate up the skies. It flew at an astonishing 427 miles per hour, one of the first fighter planes to fly more than 400 miles an hour. Best of all, at higher altitudes, the plane no longer lost speed, it gained it. Back in the States, Schmoo had begun transplants of a Merlin 61 engine himself. His converted plane was taken into the air within weeks of the British sortie. The plane soared, veered, dove, peeled off the coast, then south toward San Diego, racing along the shore, then north again. It aced its tests. The Mustang became the Merlin Mustang, and the P-51A was re-specified as the P-51B. A bold new breed was in the sky, ready to attack the 1,000-year Reich. And then that winter, the Mustang got lost. The Merlin Mustang project disappeared in a swamp of bureaucratic delays and Pentagon red tape. The Air Force generals seemed to turn their backs on it. In England, those who knew what the plane could do could not understand why. Now Margaret will tell you what happened to the Mustang next.
So the man who was responsible for breaking through Air Force resistance to the Mustang was Tommy Hitchcock. On paper, Tommy might not have seemed like the best candidate for this job, The Hitchcocks of Aiken, South Carolina, and the North Shore of Long Island were an old and very wealthy American family. Tommy attended St. Paul's School, then Harvard, and then Oxford, and then he married an heiress to the Mellon fortune. He was a partner at Lehman Brothers. His good friend F. Scott Fitzgerald idolized Tommy and made him a character in The Great Gatsby and Tender is the Night. But there was a lot more to Tommy. By the time he got to Lehman Brothers, he had already lived several other lives. In the 20s and 30s, he became an international polo star. Some said he was the greatest player in the history of the game. Slide, please. There's Tommy in his uniform.
Next slide.
Next slide. There's Tommy in his uniform in World War II. And the next slide, please. Here's Tommy in his polo gear about to play an international tournament before the war. At 17, he had dropped out of St. Paul's to fly for France in World War I. And the next slide, please. And there he is at age 17 in France flying Nieuports for the Lafayette Escadrille. When World War II broke out, he was still obsessed with aviation. By now 40 years old and too old to fly, he took a job as an air attaché at the U.S. Embassy in London, working for the American ambassador Gil Wynant, his old teacher at St. Paul's. When Tommy arrived in London in April 1942, Ronnie Harker, the test pilot we've just talked about, had just completed his dramatic test flight. Next slide. And here's Tommy in 1942 on his way to England. Tommy heard about the plans to exchange the Mustang's Allison for a Merlin engine. He visited the RAF in Duxford, where the plane was being tested. He called on the Rolls-Royce shop where the new engine was being mounted. He flew a Mustang himself, and he was hooked. By now, officials in Churchill's government had concluded that the Mustang was critical to the war effort, and they knew that only the huge wartime production capacity in the U.S. could mass produce it. But they were quickly figuring out that for some reason, the American Air Force was not on board. Hitchcock decided he would do something about that. He sent telegrams and memos to officials in Washington praising the Mustang. He launched a charm offensive to win over high-ranking 8th Air Force officers in England to the Mustang cause. War had been declared in December 1941, and within a few months, the 8th Air Force was already a presence in England, building fighter and bomber bases in the Southeast, moving thousands of men and planes onto British soil. England was fast becoming the largest stationary aircraft carrier in human history. Tommy began to give dinner parties at his London flat to introduce 8th Air Force officers to Mustang fans in the RAF. He also made sure some of the newly converted Merlin Mustangs were sent to the 8th for testing, and he enlisted Ambassador Wynant to help him lobby Washington from the embassy. But when it was clear that the Army Air Forces would not budge on the Mustang, Tommy decided to take his crusade to the States. At the Pentagon, he met with Hap Arnold, who by now was then head of the Army Air Forces in both Europe and the Pacific. Arnold dismissed him. Next slide, please. And there's Hap Arnold, head of what was then called the Army Air Forces. There was no need for a British product, Arnold said. The Allison engine was plenty good enough. There was no interest in the Merlin Mustang, Arnold said. Through his family, Tommy knew the Roosevelts. So now he met with FDR at the White House. And Roosevelt tried to intervene, but still not much happened. Very few planes left the North American aviation factory. So Tommy began to crisscross the country. To Wright Field in Ohio, where the plane would be ordered, to Los Angeles, where it would be made, to Detroit, where the Merlin engine would be manufactured, and back to Washington. Everywhere along the way, he talked to the press, waging a campaign to win hearts and minds for the Mustang. What he saw in his travels was FDR's great arsenal of democracy in action. His huge war production engine milling out airplanes at Northrop, Douglas, Lockheed for the war effort, but not at North American. P-51 production was clearly stalled. What was the reason? Tommy himself thought it was American prejudice against the British. Because it was made for the British and it now had a British engine, many believed the Mustang must be inferior. As Tommy said, it was not invented here. Cronyism was also widespread among Air Force officials. Many of them favored planes that were already obsolete against the German fighters. And we also know that one Air Force officer, General Bennett Myers, was downright corrupt. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of the infamous General Myers. Myers gave out contracts for new airplanes to manufacturers who ordered the small airplane parts he made at a little factory he owned on the side. North American never ordered parts from Myers' company, and North America's contract for the Mustang was delayed. Did payoffs and kickbacks play a role in the obstruction of the P-51B? We think so. But maybe the most important reason the Mustang was not embraced by the Air Force was an idea called bomber theory. Hap Arnold and his generals, the so-called bomber mafia, believed that bombers, flying fast and high and heavily armed, would be invincible in the sky. They would always reach their target. They did not need fighters to protect them. This theory had prevailed in the Air Force for decades, and Hap Arnold still believed it. But by now, the United States was a year into the war. Planning had begun for D-Day, and D-Day would be impossible as long as the Germans had air superiority. Allied troops would be cut down by the Luftwaffe as they came ashore on the Normandy beaches and made their way across France. The Allies would need to decimate the Luftwaffe for D-Day to go forward. The bombers would need to get in over Germany to destroy the German Air Force, its ability to manufacture airplanes, and the fuel to fly them. Tommy Hitchcock understood that to do this, the bombers would need long-range fighters to protect them. And the fighters the Americans had were not adequate. The range of the Thunderbolt, the P-47, was too short, and the Lightning, the P-38, had engine problems that too often caused it to turn back short of the target. Slide, please. Yeah, and here's a picture of the P-47 Thunderbolt, better known as the Jug because of its resemblance to a milk carton. Then the bombers were left exposed. The Germans would pounce and the bombers would be cut down like so many coveys of quail. Next slide. And here is the P-38 Lightning, which was actually a great fighter, except for its engine that tended to catch fire. In fact, more Lightnings were lost this way than were lost to the enemy. The Mustang, with its prodigious range of over 2,000 miles, could follow the bombers all the way to the target, protect them, and bring them home again. Tommy knew the Mustang was the answer to the Allies' problem. At Casablanca in January 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met to plan D-Day. They agreed on what would be called the combined bomber offensive. Germany would be bombed around the clock, the British bombing by night, the Americans by day. The operation got underway that summer, and by August, without any fighter escort, the American bombers were running into serious trouble. An attack on the oil fields at Ploiesh lost 145 of the Allied bombers on the mission and 300 men. Slide, please. Here's a picture of the Ploiesh raid. 2 weeks later, an attack in Bavaria on the Schweinfurt ball bearing plant and the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Regensburg lost 60 American bombers. By now, it was obvious that daylight bombing missions without fighter escort were suicide. But Hap Arnold was under huge pressure in Washington to show results, and he still seemed to believe in bomber theory. So he kept on launching the raids over Germany without fighter escort. Finally, that October of 1943 came Armageddon. A second raid on Schweinfurt was a bloodbath. The Luftwaffe put up 350 fighters, everything it had. 60 American bombers were shot down. 642 airmen lost their lives. Slide, please. And here is a picture of a stricken B-17 in that raid. The raid became known as Black Thursday. Bombing came to a halt. The press was outraged. Members of Congress protested. Air crewmen threatened to mutiny. The bomber theory was in shambles. At long last, Hap Arnold reversed himself. He ordered full steam ahead on Mustang production. Slide, please. And here we have a picture of Hap Arnold and Dutch Kindleberger, the head of North American Aviation, at about the time that North American finally received the Mustang contract from the Army Air Forces. 295 planes came out of North American's factory in November, 332 in December, 370 in January, 482 in March, and 700 planes a month by August 1944. Soon hundreds, then thousands of Mustangs were being flown to the East Coast, then crossing the Atlantic to England. Tommy Hitchcock's crusade had prevailed at last. The Mustangs were arriving, but the Germans still controlled the air over Europe. D-Day was less than 6 months away. There was still a big job to do.
The P-51s at last made it to the European theater that winter and took up the urgent, crucial duty for which they were conceived, protecting the bombers and inserting them deep into Germany. In 6 fast months, the Mustangs stymied the Luftwaffe, then defeated it, then smashed it. But first there would be one more obstacle. When the Merlin Mustang arrived in England, it was assigned to the 9th Air Force for tactical duty rather than to the 8th for bomber escort. It seemed the Air Force still did not understand what the Mustang could do. The man who brought the Merlin Mustang to the 8th Air Force in the front lines for escort duty was Colonel Don Blakesley, the roughneck maverick fighter ace who led the 4th Fighter Group in England. Blakesley was probably the most experienced pilot in the European theater in 1942. Slide, please. And that's Don Blakesley in the cockpit of his Mustang. An Ohioan from the small town of Fairport Harbor near Lake Erie, Blakesley had a passion for flying from boyhood. He had flown for the Royal Canadian Air Force and then in the Eagle squadrons, American volunteers flying for England before the U.S. entered the war. He had won the Distinguished Flying Cross and achieved ace status, trucking up 5 kills by August 1942. He was 25 years old. Blakesley flew the Mustang when it arrived in England and lost his heart to it. He proselytized for the plane among the top Air Force brass, spreading its gospel to the highest levels. He relentlessly lobbied General William Kepner, head of the 8th Air Force's Fighter Command, to transfer all Mustangs to the 8th. Photo, please. And that's General Kepner on the right and Blakesley on the left. Kepner was reluctant, but Blakesley promised to check out the pilots on the new plane in minutes, not days. The general agreed, and the Mustang began to feed out to all the waiting fighter groups, the 354th in December 1943, 2 more groups in January, Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group in February, 5 more by April, another 6 by September. By the fall of 1944, every 8th Air Force Fighter Group in England would be equipped with Mustangs but one. The 8th Air Force was the P-51 Mustang. By the spring, The P-51Bs had joined the massive 1,000-bomber deep penetration raids into Germany, and very soon they began to cut the Luftwaffe to ribbons. That March 6th, Mustangs escorted 660 heavy bombers for the first American raid on Berlin, and Blakeley led the mission. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses, shielded by Merlin Mustangs, hammered the German capital and brought the air power of the mighty 8th Air Force to the city. Those 660 bombers dumped 1,626 tons of bombs on the area that day, losing only 69 planes for about a 10% loss rate, which with the Mustangs on the mission was far lower than in the autumn raids. Mustangs claimed an astounding 8-to-1 kill ratio attack. Quote, "The first time your bombers came over Hanover, escorted by fighters, I began to be worried," end quote, German Luftwaffe chieftain Hermann Goering told Allied interrogators after the war. Quote, "When they came in with fighter escort over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," end quote. Next photo, please. And this is the backbone of the bombing forces, the B-17 flying fortress bomber. The most successful version of it was the B-17G. Next slide, please. And this is a B-17 called the Lady Bedlam, and she is on a raid over Berlin, I think. You can see the bombs dropping to the ground in what is called a stick, and you can see why it's called a stick. The bombs are falling in such a straight pattern. Next slide, please. This is the B-24 Liberator, another heavy bomber that gained great successes in the war over Europe. It was a little smaller than the B-17, but a very effective weapon on precision bombing assignments. Next slide, please. This is Joe Peterburst, a P-51 Mustang fighter pilot, who we interviewed for the book. Joe destroyed 6 Messerschmitts, but he wasn't counted as an ace. To be an ace, you had to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. So Joe's 6 on the ground didn't count, but he had a wonderful war anyway. Next slide, please. This is a wingman of Joe Peterburst. This is Lucky Loman. Lucky was also in the 55th Fighter Squadron of the 20th Fighter Group, along with Joe Peterburst. Next slide, please. And this is General Charles E. McGee. He was in the Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black fighter pilot unit. And General McGee made it all the way up to the general officer rank. The Tuskegee Airmen turned out to be among the best aviators in the whole Air Force. And bomber crews would argue and fight over who was going to get the Tuskegee Airmen to be their escorts. So they were very sought after. By April, air superiority was swinging to the Allies, thanks in large part to the Mustang. The Mustangs were at last inserting the bombers all over Germany, hitting Schweinfurt again, Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, Mannheim, Ludwigshafen. D-Day could now go forward. But Tommy Hitchcock would not live to see it. Back in England, and investigating a mechanical problem that had showed up in the new Mustang Ds, he took off in one, put it into a dive and couldn't get it out. He was killed in the crash. Tommy's vision and persistence had played a crucial role in the Normandy invasion, but he died 6 weeks before D-Day. And then on the morning of June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare unfurled on the Normandy beaches of France. Next slide, please. 3,000 landing craft and 156,000 troops made their way ashore. 8 Air Force fighters formed an airborne wall to keep the Luftwaffe from reaching the landing area. The P-51s flew all night and all the next day, returning to base only to refuel. The D-Day landings have been made possible by destroying Luftwaffe planes on the ground and in the air over Germany through the spring of 1944. And strafing attacks by the Mustangs on D-Day of everything that moved on the rails and roads kept the Germans from moving up to the beaches as the Allies came ashore. The Luftwaffe could mount only 200 aircraft on D-Day compared to 12,000 planes in the aerial armada the Allies launched. The land war now commanded the stage as the Allies advanced through France. After the breakout from Normandy and the Cotentin Peninsula, after D-Day, the Battle of France took center stage as British, Canadian, French, and American forces pushed east, covered by Mustangs from the air. Allied planes continued to pound Fortress Germany and occupied France, Politz, Hamburg, Peenemünde, and Merseburg. At Politz, bombers and Mustangs raided synthetic oil facilities. At Peenemünde, the site of V1 and V2 rocket development, Mustangs in the 20th Fighter Group shot down 23 German planes and bagged 9 on the ground. That's the 20th Fighter Group, of which Lucky Loman and Joe Peterburst were part. The hurtling air war continued without letting up or missing a beat. Now on the land below, Generals Patton and J. Lawton, Lightning Joe Collin, and British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery all closed in toward Germany and the Rhine River. The Russian armies closed in front from the east. The jaws of the Allied divides finally crushed between their narrowing maws, the last faltering Nazi resistance at long last reaching Berlin. Next photo, please. And that's a picture of the Führer bunker where Hitler spent the last of his days. On the night of April 28th and 29th, after midnight, Adolf Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun. The following day, the two committed suicide together. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the Navy chief, was anointed as the last Führer. P-51s flew in triumph to the end. Next slide, please. A pride of Mustangs from the 4th and 20th Fighter Groups provided top cover to the left for advancing troops, stopping everything that moved on the ground and in the air. Then the curtain dropped over the whole wide, sprawling domain of Europe. On May 7th, General Eisenhower presided over the signing of the German unconditional surrender, and the Mustangs parked at their bases all over England after their last act. A lightning-fast 18-month victory had brought their allies to peace. By the war's end, 15,000 P-51As, Bs, Cs, and Ds had been milled out of North America's plants in Los Angeles and Dallas. Slide, please. And this is one of the restored Mustangs. They had flown more than 200,000 missions and over 1 million combat hours. P-51s had destroyed almost 5,000 German planes in the air and on the ground. This was almost half the enemy aircraft destroyed in Europe by American fighters. Mustangs went on to fight in Korea. They proved effective against Russian MiG jets, but by then the jet age had dawned and the sun was setting on the propeller-driven aircraft. Mustangs are still restored and flown by amateurs and aficionados. They have been used as racing planes. The actor Tom Cruise owns a P-51 Mustang. The airplane of Victor Schmued, Tommy Hitchcock, and Don Blakesley closed one age of World War and opened another of jet fighters, rockets, and shuttles that led to the journey to outer space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret David. That was a wonderful talk, and the slides are beautiful. I think we've got already questions in the queue. I'm just going to stop here for a minute. Bear with me 1 second. 99 talks, and I'm share slides. Okay. I'll tell you what, Mike. I think I called on you last time, so why don't you lead us off this time? If you want to unmute line and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm from a remote point. So can you hear me?
Yeah, a little, but we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, if you have trouble hearing me, just let me know. I'll move to a different spot. I had to technically see where as far as the question goes, and this is not to take anything from the P-51, but in 1943, the bomber offensive, the daylight precision bombing was actually having very good results, important results. The bomber was getting through. For the most part, bombs were hitting the target or the target and everything, causing damage and causing delays, if not permanent damage, to German industry, but definitely important delays. In the first Schweinfurt raid, production went down by 38%. And by the way, the RAF was supposed to come in and finish the job that night, but they had to bomb a place called Peenemünde for some reason, such as German rocket. And in the second raid, it was decreased by 68%. They had decentralized the ball bearing industry. The ball bearing industry was hurt. German industry was hurt. And this was before the P-51 was introduced as a fighter that can get through. I would suggest, and I want to hear your reaction to this, I would suggest that the primary accomplishment of the P-51 was not to enable the bomber in getting through, but simply reduce losses, where even though the U.S. had enough personnel to replace them, Americans don't like high losses, and that is used to it, let's say the Soviets are. So to reduce losses of the bombers on these raids that were working, and to also, the very important thing is in air-to-air combat, eliminating more German fighters, substantially more German fighters than bombers.
That's right.
So I'd like to hear your reaction.
Releasing the fighters, right?
Mike, I think you have an extremely good point that in 1943, the bombers were scoring successes, but the loss rates were devastating. And the Air Force considered the loss rates unsustainable. In some raids, they lost as many as 75% of the bombers. I think you're right that the chief achievement of P-51 was to cut losses, but cutting losses was the name of the game, and being able to assure that the bombers got to their targets and reducing those losses was really the name of the game. So whether you call it reducing losses or knocking out the Luftwaffe, I think that was the major achievement of the Mustang.
Well, just to follow up on that, remember, half of the losses were done by flak, although it's hard to tell sometimes how much damage to a bomber was done by what brought the bomber. Yeah, is it the flak or the fighter? But flak was a lot of that. But also, no, that there were. I've heard of none where there were 75% casualties. Among 75% were claimed losses, not on a large scale raid. But it's just that whereas, let's say, the Soviets could sustain 20, 30, 40% casualties, Americans couldn't because of American public opinion. The real thing it accomplished had to do with morale and, of course, American public opinion. Nobody wanted to see, even if they could replace the personnel, nobody wanted to see 10 or 15 or 20% losses at that rate, even if they could be replaced. But that the most significant thing that the P-51 did was, again, shooting down a substantially larger number of German aircraft. That's what the crux in our question.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you, Mike. David, did you want to respond? I was gonna move to the next question.
I was just gonna point out that, the Mustangs really became effective when General Doolittle took over, the Eighth Air Force and released them from escort duty to go out and chase the German fighters. This was the turning point and really made the Mustangs much more effective. I don't know. There's also that staggering number that Mustangs were shot down 5,000 German aircraft. Half of the German aircraft shot down by other American fighters, the P-38, the P-47, other American fighters. We came out strongly believing that the Mustang was arguably the hinge that swung the war.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. That answers the question. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great, you go.
Mark, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. You can hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
loud.
Okay, great. Thank you for the presentation. My question has to do is a little bit on the technical side in terms of the P-51. One of its great advantages, as you pointed out, was that it was aerodynamically very efficient. Therefore, I think there's 2,000-mile range. But anytime you're designing an airplane or a tank or something like that, there are always trade-offs. And my understanding is that some of the trade-offs that you had to leave on the table, so to speak, in order to get that range was attributes that were very useful in dogfighting, quick turns and things like that.
Yep.
Could you just kind of highlight some of these things and how did the U.S. pilots adapt to these weaknesses in terms of tactics?
You're talking about the attributes of the P-51 Mustang.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, the first one was the laminar flow wings. The laminar flow wings essentially gave the aircraft greater lift. And that greatly influenced its aerodynamic aspect. The laminar flow wing had the bulge in the wing set back further from the front than conventional wings. And this vastly boosted the lift of the Mustang and gave it greater maneuverability. The second thing was the Merlin 61. The engine was just a powerhouse, and it made them capable to fly so fast. And the two airplanes would be flying at each other at 700 miles an hour. The Air Force created a CME, a Central Medical Establishment, to treat combat fatigue in pilots because it had become so fast. It had become very cold up in the sky. It had become very fast, and battle flicked by in seconds. So the Merlin Mustang, which gave the Mustang so much power, was the second attribute. The duralumin fuselage was very light, and that helped it. And the curves, the diminishing curves of the fuselage also gave it aerodynamic capability. But the aerodynamic possibilities of the Mustang were phenomenal. And that's what Harker saw when he took the Mustang on its flight, that this superb aerodynamic performance, if mated with a more powerful engine, could really produce a superb warhorse. and that's what they did. And the Merlin Mustang proved to be a signal airplane.
And in terms of the downsides, because you mentioned a bunch of technical aspects of the plane that allowed it for that long, to have that long range, but did that then also mean have some disadvantages when it came to dogfighting?
No, the problems, the real lion of Mustangs was the P-51D, as in Don. The P-51D scored the most number of victories and was the most successful copy of the Mustang. It had problems at the start, and those problems were really the only problems that Mustangs had, but it's fascinating. The Schmood immediately got to work on figuring out what was going on with the P-51Ds, and he found that it was the ammunition boxes in the wings, which didn't permit the wings to flex and go through torsion as they should, and they would plunge the wings, unable to perform as they should, through the plane into a nosedive from which you couldn't get it out. So that was the only real problem that affected the Mustangs widely, and the Mustangs pilots who we talked to, every one of them said that their praise for the Mustang was had no limits, and one of them said to us, "You didn't fly a Mustang, you wore a Mustang."
Yeah.
And I think that shows the closeness that they felt with the airplane.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. We have a few questions in the queue. Tom asked about, could you talk a little bit more about the transition from the Allison to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine? Were there any technical or political obstacles to that? And how were the engines delivered to the 9th and 8th Air Forces?
The conversion to the Merlin 61 engine raised tremendous problems in the Air Force, which didn't want the English engine. Those problems were huge and difficult and cost a lot of time. The transition to the Merlin 61 was finally consummated when Rolls-Royce gave a license to Packard Motor Company to manufacture Packard Merlin engines, which were essentially the Merlin 61 engine, to Packard, and Packard had the license to build the engines for the Mustangs. And then the Mustangs were flown, they were produced in Los Angeles and Dallas. They were flown to the East Coast, and then most of them came by Liberty ship, came by freighter across the Atlantic to England. There were huge problems in the conversion to the Merlin 61. 9,000 drawings were given by Rolls-Royce to Packard to achieve the production of the Packard Merlin engine. I think Merlin, I think Rolls-Royce had 10 technicians who lived in the States and supervised the production of the Merlin. It was all different because in England, all this work was done by hand. And in America, it was all done on assembly lines by unskilled labor. And so there were some pretty great problems in the transition. But the license to Packard really got it going.
David, there's a follow-up. A few people are asking about just the logistics with the plane made in the US and the engines in Europe. How were they assembled? Like, what was the logistic supply chain for assembling the plane?
Well, the most important point is that the engines weren't made in Europe. They were made in America by Packard Merlin. In fact, the total number of Merlin 61 engines produced by Rolls-Royce was 6. It produced only 6 true Merlin 61s. And at that point, everybody jumped on the Packard bandwagon, and Packard took over production of the Merlin 61 engine. So they were really manufactured over here in Detroit. The engines were manufactured in Detroit. The airplanes were manufactured in Los Angeles and Dallas. The Los Angeles version was the P-51B. The Dallas version was the P-51C. There was no difference between them, and they were exactly the same airplane. It was just the provenance of the airplanes that gave them the different lettering.
That's interesting. Could you talk a little bit about your research? We've got a few questions on that. What kind of archives and the type of research you did for the book?
This is a great story, because we wrote this book and researched it during COVID, during the pandemic. The first thing we learned was that the Air Force Archive was closed due to the pandemic. So we looked at each other and said, that looks like the end of this book. And let me stop and say very quickly, the genesis of this book is fascinating. It comes from Margaret's father, who was a ground officer in the 20th Fighter Group, which Lucky Loman, Wallace Loman, and Joe Peterborough were in. And Margaret's father was in the ground crew of the 20th Fighter Group, and she grew up hearing stories about all the famous fighter pilots and all the exploits of the P-51s, and she began reading about it, and she finally said to me, we got to do a book on this. It's just too amazing. This plane that comes in like the Green Bay Packers and turns the whole war around. And so I said, absolutely, we got to do a book on this. When we had started on the book, we finally got to find a wonderful organization called the National Air Force, the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth Air Force. And we got in touch with them, and they had all the Air Force records, plus diaries, memoirs, letters home. And the head of research at the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth Air Force was an angel from heaven. And without her, we couldn't have written the book. She figured out a way for me to search their archives digitally. And then I would select things, and she would find them and send them to me electronically, digitally. So I had all the equipment we needed from the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth Air Force, and we managed to get around that. We had done all our interviewing before COVID hit. We found only 4 living P-51 pilots and talked to all of them. We talked to some bomber people, but this population is getting very old. One of the Mustang pilots, General McGee, died 2 months after I had interviewed him. And one of the bomber crewmen, a navigator, died in 2021. So it was getting hard to find Mustang people. And I can't remember what your original question was about.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Just asking about the archival research, how you went about
Yeah.
going about it. Sounds like pretty thorough. And it seems like
The San Diego Air and Space Museum archives were another treasure trove for us. They had a lot of stuff on Ed Schmood. The National Archives were a treasure trove for us, and had a lot on General Bennett Myers and other subjects. So there was a lot of archival research and a lot of interviewing. We traveled to Sacramento, to San Diego, to Washington, to Massachusetts. We traveled all over the country interviewing people to do this.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and we very much appreciate you joining us. I think we're at the top of the hour here, so I want to give a thank you to our speakers, David and Margaret White, for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Wings of War, the World War II fighter plane that saved the Allies and the believers who made it fly. Please join us next Tuesday, October 14th at 8 p.m. when Hal Friedman will discuss the third volume of his trilogy, Blue versus Purple, the U.S. Naval War College, the Soviet Union, and the New Enemy in the Pacific. As an aside, that is our 100th talk, so looking very forward to that. Hopefully you can join us. Until then, thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you next week. David and Margaret, thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Greg, and it was a pleasure and an honor to appear before this group.
Oh, no, it was wonderful. Thank you. Take care, everyone.